Few monarchs in English history have fallen as far, as fast, or as dramatically as King Richard II. When he inherited the throne in 1377, he was a 10-year-old boy, the grandson of Edward III, one of the greatest medieval kings. England was wealthy, powerful, and victorious in the Hundred-Year War, but by the time Richard was overthrown in 1399, the kingdom was divided, bankrupt, and bitter. His own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, invaded England, captured him without a real battle, and deposed him, and within a few months, Richard II was dead, starved to death in captivity. The story of Richard II is one of pride, vanity, extravagance, and disastrous misjudgment. His reign represents a textbook example of how a king could destroy his own authority through arrogance and misrule. In many ways, Richard II was the worst kind of medieval monarch, one who believed deeply in his divine right to rule, but lacked the wisdom, humility, and political skill to wield that power. Richard II became king in 1377, at only 10 years old, after the death of his grandfather, Edward III. His father, the Black Prince, England's great military hero, had died a year earlier, leaving the throne to a child. The country he inherited was unstable. The long war with France was draining the treasury, taxation was high, and the Black Death had devastated the population a generation earlier. At first, the kingdom was ruled by a council of nobles led by his uncles, including John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. A powerful and experienced man, but Richard grew up surrounded by wealth and flattery in the royal household, and from an early age he was told he was chosen by God. This belief in his divine right to rule became a dangerous obsession that would define his entire reign. The first test of Richard's kingship came in 1381, when the Peasants' Revolt broke out. It was one of the most dramatic uprisings in English history. Peasants and townsmen across southern England rose up against harsh taxes and corrupt officials. Thousands of rebels, led by Wat Tyler, marched on London, demanding an end to serfdom, the removal of hated royal advisers, and even the abolition of the monarchy. Richard was only 14, and he was surprised everyone by showing remarkable courage. He rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End and later at Smithfield, where Wat Tyler was killed. He calmed the crowd and promised reforms, and for a brief moment the teenage king seemed a hero, a natural leader who could command respect even from a mob. But Richard's actions afterwards destroyed this reputation. As soon as he regained control, he broke every promise he had made to the rebels. The king's words, he said, meant nothing when spoken under duress. He ordered brutal reprisals and thousands were executed. This early act of duplicity revealed Richard's deep flaws, arrogance, deceit, and vindictiveness, traits that would only grow stronger as he got older. As Richard reached adulthood, he surrounded himself with a circle of favourites, courtiers who flattered him and encouraged his belief that he was semi-divine. Among these were Robert de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, and Michael de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk. They encouraged Richard's taste of luxury and ceremony, and the royal court became a place of astonishing extravagance. Richard loved art, fashion, and pageantry. He introduced new court customs borrowed from France. He wore elaborate robes of silk and gold, and he insisted that people bow or kneel in his presence. He built the magnificent Westminster Hall roof and commissioned lavish works of art. But this splendour came at a cost. England was already in debt from war, and Richard's extravagance infuriated both the nobility and the common people. He rewarded his favourites with titles, lands, and wealth, while sidelining experienced lords who had served his grandfather. The old nobility saw this as a direct insult and a threat to the traditional balance of power. By the late 1380s, England was on the brink of civil war. The powerful nobles, known as the Lord Appellant, rose against Richard's corrupt favourites, led by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Gloucester, and the Earls of Arundel, Warwick, and Nottingham. They accused Richard's inner circle of treason. In 1388, they confronted the king and forced him to hand over his friends. A brutal purge followed, and Robert de Vere fled abroad, and several of Richard's ministers were executed in what became known as the Merciless Parliament. Humiliated, Richard was forced to accept the Lords Appellant's authority, and for a time England seemed to return to a stable government, but Richard never forgave the humiliation. He waited more than a decade to take his revenge. After 1389, Richard entered what seemed like a more peaceful phase. He announced that he would rule as a king should, and restored some order to the kingdom, but beneath the surface, resentment and paranoia simmered. Richard had developed a dangerous obsession with royal majesty. He believed the king was God's representative on earth and should be obeyed absolutely. He even compared himself to Christ and expected his subjects to treat him with near religious reverence. He ordered that images of himself be displayed in churches and on public buildings, dressed in gold robes and crowned like a saint. He surrounded himself with small, secretive court and began to speak in almost mystical terms about the sanctity of kingship. This cult of the king isolated him further from the nobles, who viewed his behaviour as delusional. To the common people he appeared remote and unapproachable, a monarch who had lost all sense of reality. Richard's final years were marked by outright tyranny. By the late 1390s, he had consolidated power and was ready to strike back at those who humiliated him earlier in his reign. In 1397, he arrested 3 of the Lords Appellant, the Duke of Gloucester, the Earl of Arundel, and the Earl of Warwick, accusing them of treason for their actions a decade before. Gloucester was secretly murdered at Calais, Arundel was executed, and Warwick was exiled. Richard used fear and intimidation to silence opposition. He expanded the power of the royal household, packed Parliament with loyalists, and ruled by decree. He revived ancient laws to confiscate property from his enemies and filled his treasury through forced loans and fines. This period is sometimes called Richard's tyranny, and it stands as one of the darkest moments in medieval English politics. His reign became a warning of what happens when a monarch believed himself above the law. One of Richard's gravest mistakes was his treatment of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. Henry had once been one of the Lords Appellant, but had since reconciled with the king. In 1398, a quarrel broke out between Henry and another noble, Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. Richard decided to exile both men, Henry for 10 years and Norfolk for life. When John of Gaunt died the following year, Richard seized his vast estates instead of allowing Henry to inherit them. It was a stunning act of greed and stupidity. By denying one of England's most powerful nobles his rightful inheritance, Richard turned a potential ally into a mortal enemy. In June of 1399, while Richard was campaigning in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England with a small army, supposedly only to reclaim his inheritance. But his cause quickly gained support. The nobles who had suffered under Richard's tyranny joined him, and the common people, wary of the king's oppression and extravagance, welcomed Henry as a liberator. Richard hurried back from Ireland, but his support crumbled. Hardly anyone was willing to fight for him. He surrendered at Flint Castle without a battle, trusting that Henry would treat him fairly. It was a catastrophic misjudgment. Henry marched him to London as a prisoner, and in Parliament Richard was forced to abdicate, publicly handing over the crown to Henry, who became King Henry IV. Chroniclers recorded that Richard appeared broken, silent, and humiliated, a man who had lost everything through his own arrogance. Richard was taken north to Pontefract Castle, where he was imprisoned under harsh conditions. In early 1400, news spread that he had died, most likely starved to death, though some sources suggest he was murdered. His body was displayed in London to prove he was dead, and then buried quietly at King's Langley, before later being reinterred at Westminster Abbey. His death ended the direct Plantagenet line and began the Lancastrian dynasty, but it also left a deep scar on England. The manner of his downfall, A king deposed by his cousin set a dangerous precedent. It opened the door to the bloody dynastic struggles of 15th century, including the Wars of the Roses. Richard's reign was a lesson in how not to be king. His failings were not merely political, they were personal and moral. He believed he ruled by divine right, but lacked the strength and discipline to lead. Arrogance and delusion of grandeur were one of the reasons why Richard failed. He believed he was chosen by God and could not do wrong. His obsession with royal ceremony and his demand for near worship from his subjects turned him into a figure of ridicule and resentment. He squandered the wealth of the kingdom on luxury art and gifts to his favourite whilst imposing heavy taxes on his people. England was nearly bankrupt by the end of his reign, and instead of forgiving his enemies or ruling fairly, Richard spent years plotting revenge against those who had opposed him. His use of execution, exile, and confiscation of property destroyed the trust in the monarchy. And unlike his grandfather, Edward III, or his father, the Black Prince, Richard had no military skill. He failed to defend England's interests in France and Ireland and avoided personal combat or risk. His cowardice and indecision weakened England's international position. And by surrounding himself with sycophants and excluding experienced nobles, he cut himself off from reality. His harsh taxes and authoritarian rule made him hated by the people who once admired his youthful courage. His exile of Henry Bolingbroke and seizure of the Lancastrian estates was political suicide. It united his enemies and ensured his own downfall. In short, Richard II was the architect of his own ruin. His pride blinded him to the limits of kingship. Where other medieval kings balanced power and pragmatism, Richard demanded obedience without earning the respect. His downfall was not a tragedy of bad luck, but of his own making. Richard II's disastrous reign reshaped England's monarchy. It taught later kings that power without consent led to rebellion. Henry IV, and later the Tudors, would learn to rule more carefully, though the lessons were not always remembered. He left a strange cultural legacy. The playwright William Shakespeare later portrayed him as a tragic figure, poetic, sensitive, and undone by fate. In Richard II, Shakespeare gives him beautiful speeches about kingship and mortality, turning him into a man to pity rather than despise. But history tells a harsher story. The real Richard was not a saintly dreamer, but a vain, tyrannical ruler who destroyed himself through his own hubris. King Richard II's reign stands as one of the most catastrophic in English history, from his betrayal to the peasants to his persecution of nobles, from his wasteful spending to his paranoid tyranny. He turned a strong kingdom into a fractured and resentful one. His belief in his own divinity blinded him to the realities of leadership, and his cruelty ensured that when the end came, no one lifted a sword to save him. He was not merely a bad king, he was the worst kind of king, one who mistook his crown for a halo, and in the end that mistake cost him his throne, his life, and England's stability for generations to come. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.